Welcome to History to Relax, where we take our time, breathe deeply, and wander through the past one calm step at a time. Tonight, we'll explore the remarkable journey of New York City, from its earliest days as the homeland of the Lenape people, through its centuries of change, triumphs, and challenges, all the way to the vibrant crossroads it is today. Before we begin, I'd like to invite you to support the channel by clicking the like button, subscribing if you haven't already, and letting us know in the comments where in the world you're listening from. It's always wonderful to hear how far our stories travel. Now, find a comfortable place to sit or lie down. Let your shoulders drop, your breathing slow, and your thoughts settle. You're safe here, with nothing to do but follow the gentle rhythm of our journey. When you're ready, we'll step softly into the story and watch the centuries unfold. Part 1. The Land Before the City. Before the first mapmaker etched the outline of Manhattan onto paper, before any ship's mast appeared along the horizon, the land was already alive. Here, where rivers met the sea, the Lenape people moved with the rhythm of the seasons. They lived not in towering stone structures, but in longhouses and wigwams, built from saplings bent into frames and covered in bark or mats woven from reeds. These dwellings stood in small clusters along the shorelines, surrounded by forests that reached down to the water's edge. The land they called home was generous. The tidal rivers teemed with shad, sturgeon, and striped bass. Clams and oysters grew in thick beds along the mudflats, and the forests offered deer, black bear, and turkey. Streams spilled over rocky beds, feeding marshes where cranberries ripened in the autumn. For the Lenape, this place was not merely a backdrop to their lives, it was a living partner. They took from it what they needed, always with the understanding that the balance had to be kept. In summer, fishing and planting shaped the days. The women tended fields of corn, beans, and squash, the three sisters that grew best together, each supporting the others in soil and space. Children played nearby, their voices carrying over the rustle of leaves. The men hunted or went to the rivers in dugout canoes, their paddles slipping into the water without a splash. In winter, they followed game into deeper forests, setting traps or carrying boughs. The Lenape were traders long before Europeans arrived. Paths through the woods connected their villages, and canoes carried them along the Hudson River and its tributaries. Wampum, beads crafted from shells, served both as a form of currency and as a way of recording agreements. Stories, too, traveled these routes, tales of creation, of ancestors, and of lessons taught by the natural world. Around evening fires, elders told of the Great Spirit, Kishelamukong, and of the cycles that kept life turning. The waterways shaped more than travel. They marked the boundaries of different Lenape groups, each with its own sachem or leader. Leadership was not a matter of absolute command but of consensus, built on persuasion and respect. Decisions about hunting grounds, peace, or war came after discussion in council, where the voices of many were heard before action was taken. The island now called Manhattan was rich with resources. Its rocky heights offered clear views of the surrounding waters, useful for spotting both game and approaching visitors. Its southern tip, where two rivers met the bay, was particularly fertile ground for fishing and trade. Here, small settlements thrived, each aware of the tides that rose and fell twice a day, shaping the pace of life. To the Lenape, the land's value could not be measured in coins or deeds. Ownership in the European sense, the idea of holding a piece of land as a possession, was foreign. Land was to be shared, used wisely, and passed on in good condition to future generations. They understood change would come with the seasons, but the cycles always returned. This constancy anchored their way of life. The forests that blanketed the island were a mix of oak, hickory, chestnut, and maple. In the autumn, the colors deepened to crimson and gold, and nuts fell in abundance. The air grew sharper, and smoke from village fires curled into the sky. Along the shores, flocks of waterfowl gathered before their long journeys south. In spring, The trees would green again, and the rivers would swell with melting snow from the mountains to the north. From the highest ridges, one could see far into the distance. To the east lay the Great Bay, its waters flecked with whitecaps when the wind turned strong. To the west, the land rolled gently toward more forests and rivers. On clear days, the sky seemed endless, its blue mirrored in the wide river that would one day bear the name Hudson. The Lenape's knowledge of their environment was deep and precise. They knew where the salmon would leap in season, where medicinal plants grew in shaded hollows, and which trees would yield the strongest wood for building. Their lives were tied to the patterns of nature, and they read the world as others might read a map. Though their days were filled with work, planting, harvesting, hunting, and preparing food for the winter, they also marked the passing of time with ceremonies. These gatherings brought together music, dance, and feasting. Rattles and drums kept the rhythm as dancers moved in patterns passed down through generations. In this world, before the sails of foreign ships cut the horizon, the Lenape could not know how quickly everything would change. Across the ocean, merchants, explorers, and investors were already turning their eyes toward the coasts of a continent they barely understood. The rivers and forests here would soon be measured, claimed, and transformed in ways the Lenape could not imagine. Yet in the early years of the 17th century, life along these waters still followed the old patterns. The tides came and went, the seasons turned, and the voices of the people mingled with the wind in the trees. The land remained whole, the rivers unbroken, and the island untouched by the walls and streets that would one day rise here. As the sun set over the western hills, the sky glowed with shades of orange and violet. Canoes returned to shore, the paddles lifting and dipping in steady rhythm. Fires sparked in the gathering darkness, their smoke carrying the scent of cooking fish. Families gathered, sharing stories as stars began to show above the treetops. It was a world complete in itself, a balance of water, forest, and sky, held together by the quiet knowledge that all life was connected. And so the island rested, as it had for countless generations, waiting for the moment when the quiet would be broken by the arrival of strangers, and the story of a new city would begin. Part 2. The River Explorer. In the summer of 1609, the waters at the mouth of the Great Bay reflected nothing more unusual than the passing clouds above. The Lenape continued their fishing, their hunting, their trade, unaware that far out beyond the horizon a small ship, unlike anything they had seen before, was drawing closer each day. This vessel was called the Half Main, the Half Moon, and it carried a mixed crew under the command of an Englishman sailing for the Dutch East India Company. His name was Henry Hudson, a man already seasoned by years at sea, his eyes trained on finding a passage through the mysterious northern waters to Asia. He did not set out to discover a city. He was seeking a shortcut to riches, a path to spices, silks, and treasures that lay across the world. Yet fate was leading him toward the mouth of a river that would bear his name for centuries to come. The Half Main had begun its voyage from Amsterdam in early April, cutting across the choppy waters of the North Sea before turning westward into the Atlantic. Her hull was sturdy but not large, and the voyage was not without hardship. Storms chased the ship across the ocean, forcing the crew to reef sails and cling to the wet deck as waves broke over the bow. Below, the cramped quarters were dim and close, the air heavy with the smell of salted meat and tar. By the time the coast of North America came into view in early September, the men had been at sea for months. They spotted low, forested hills and stretches of sandy shore. The coastline was unfamiliar to Hudson, but he had charts and accounts from earlier explorers who had skirted these waters. He knew that others had searched here before him, and that this land was already the focus of quiet rivalry between European powers. Sailing south from what is now Maine, Hudson traced the outline of the coast, passing bays and inlets. It was in mid-September that he guided the Half Main through the narrow opening between two spits of land into a wide bay. The water broadened before him, calm and blue, with green shores rising gently beyond. To the east lay the island that would one day be called Manhattan, though to the Lenape it was already known and named. From the deck of the Halve Main, the first impression was of abundance. Forests came down almost to the waterline. Birds wheeled overhead, their cries carried on the wind. The scent of pine and earth drifted across the bay. Hudson could not know it yet, but this place would be the seed of one of the world's great cities. For now, it was a gateway to an unknown river, and the river was what drew his attention. On the western shore, Lenape villagers noticed the strange ship almost immediately. It was unlike their dugout canoes or the smaller trading vessels of neighboring tribes. Its height, its pale sails, and the way it moved against the wind marked it as something new. Some approached in canoes, paddling out with cautious curiosity. Others watched from the shore, shaded by trees. Hudson recorded in his journal that they were met with signs of friendliness. The Lenape brought ears of corn, smoked fish, and animal skins to trade. In return, the crew offered beads, knives, and small metal tools. There was no common language, so gestures and patience carried the meaning. These exchanges were cautious, marked by the mutual awareness that both sides were stepping into unknown ground. After anchoring for the night, Hudson decided to take the Halve Main upriver. He believed, or at least hoped, that the river might lead to the long-sought passage to the Pacific. On the morning tide, they set sail northward, following the wide, calm channel. The forests closed in on either side, broken now and then by clearings where smoke from Lenape fires curled upward. As the days passed, Hudson's crew marveled at the river's breadth and depth. In places, it stretched so wide that the opposite bank was only a shadow on the horizon. They saw sturgeon leaping from the water, their silver sides catching the light. At night, they anchored in sheltered coves, listening to the sounds of the forest, the distant calls of animals, the rustle of leaves in the wind. The Lenape followed their progress from the shore, sometimes approaching in canoes to exchange goods, sometimes keeping their distance. Not all encounters were peaceful. In some places, wary groups watched from the banks, their weapons in hand. The arrival of such a large and strange vessel could not help but stir uncertainty. Hudson pushed on for nearly 2 weeks, sailing as far as present-day Albany. There, the river narrowed and became too shallow for the Halve Main to continue. The land beyond was not the route to Asia he had hoped for. It was clear the river ended in the interior, far from any western sea. Disappointment settled over the crew, but Hudson did not leave empty-handed. He had mapped a new waterway, one that would be valuable for trade. The voyage back downriver was slower. Autumn had begun to touch the forests with gold and red. The air carried a crisp edge in the mornings, and mist clung to the water until the sun rose higher. Along the way, more exchanges took place with the Lenape. Some were warm, with food and furs changing hands. Others ended in suspicion or sudden retreat. When the Halve Main reached the bay again in early October, Hudson faced a choice. He could explore further along the coast or turn east for home. The decision was made for him by the weather and the weariness of his men. They steered the ship into the open Atlantic and began the long crossing back to Europe. Hudson's report would spark Dutch interest in the region. The fertile land, the deep river, and the potential for trade were too promising to ignore. Within a few years, ships would return, not just to explore, but to stay. Wooden palisades would rise where forests once stood, and new voices would echo through the narrow paths along the shore. For the Lenape, the Halve Main's visit was a moment that seemed to pass. The ship sailed away, leaving the land as it had been. But the memory lingered, a vision of a floating village, of men dressed in cloth and metal, of tools and trinkets unlike any they had seen before. It was the beginning of a slow tide that would not turn back. As winter came to the bay, the waters iced along the edges, and the trees stood bare against the sky. In the villages, life went on as it always had, but far across the ocean, plans were already forming. The river that Henry Hudson had sailed would soon draw more ships, more settlers, and more change than anyone on its shores could imagine. And so the stage was set. The land, once known only to the people who had lived there for generations, was now a point on the maps of Europe. It was no longer simply a place of rivers, forests, and villages. It had become a destination. Part 3. The Dutch Years. When the Halve Maen returned to Europe in 1609, she carried more than a captain's log and a sketch of an unfamiliar river. She carried a story of fertile shores, deep waters, and a land rich with promise. In the offices of the Dutch East India Company, those details took root. Merchants imagined beaver pelts and timber flowing back to Amsterdam, profits counted before the first ship had even been built for the purpose. The Dutch were skilled traders, their fleets carrying goods from the Baltic to the Spice Islands. To them, the river Henry Hudson had charted was another opportunity, a thread to be woven into their global web of commerce. Within a few years, they sent vessels back to the mouth of the bay, this time not to search for Asia, but to establish a foothold. By 1614, a small trading post stood on Castle Island, near present-day Albany, far upriver from the bay. It was a modest outpost, little more than a wooden storehouse and a few huts, but it marked the beginning of Dutch presence in the region. Traders exchanged iron tools, cloth, and firearms with the local Mohican and Lenape for furs, especially beaver pelts prized in Europe for making felt hats. At the southern end of the river, the site of Hudson's first anchorage drew attention as well. The deep waters there allowed large ships to anchor close to shore, and the position at the meeting of river and bay offered a natural gateway for trade. By the early 1620s, the Dutch West India Company, newly formed to manage colonial ventures, turned its eye to permanent settlement. In 1624, the company dispatched families to the new land, scattering them across outposts in what would become New York, New Jersey, and Delaware. The next year, a larger group arrived at the southern tip of Manhattan Island. Here, on a rocky point surrounded by water on three sides, they began to build the village that would be called New Amsterdam, New Amsterdam. The earliest structures were simple, their walls of rough timber, roofs thatched with reeds. A fort was raised first, its wooden palisade enclosing storehouses and the company's quarters. Within the safety of the walls, settlers stored supplies and slept through uneasy nights, wary of storms, fire, and the unknown beyond the gates. Beyond the fort, the village began to spread. Narrow dirt paths wound between houses and gardens. Chickens scratched in the yards, and pigs rooted near the edges of the forest. The settlers planted European crops alongside local ones, wheat and barley in rows, maize in mounds. They learned quickly that the growing season was shorter than in the Netherlands, and that the weather could turn violent with little warning. Trade was the lifeblood of the settlement. From the docks, ships sailed upriver laden with cloth, beads, knives, and muskets, returning with bales of furs packed in barrels. Canoes arrived from villages along the Hudson, their paddles flashing in the sun, bringing pelts and baskets of goods. Lenape traders came not only to barter, but to see what the newcomers had brought: copper kettles, metal axes, and glass beads, items that soon found a place in native life. Relations between the Dutch and the Lenape were complex. At times, they were partners in trade, sharing food and information. At other moments, misunderstandings and disputes led to tension. The Dutch view of land as a commodity to be bought and sold clashed with the Lenape belief in shared use. In 1626, director Peter Minute famously negotiated the purchase of Manhattan from local leaders, offering goods said to be worth 60 guilders. The transaction became legend, though the value and the very nature of the agreement remained debated. To the Dutch, it was a permanent sale. To the Lenape, it may have been seen as granting temporary use. Life in New Amsterdam was not the quiet pastoral existence some settlers might have hoped for. The colony was small but bustling, a place where Dutch, Walloon, African, and native languages mixed in the air. Ships came and went with the tides, bringing news from Europe and carrying letters back across the ocean. The company governed with a firm hand, appointing officials to oversee trade, defense, and the daily affairs of the settlement. By the 1630s, stone and brick began to replace timber in the sturdier buildings, though many homes remained modest. A windmill rose on a hill to grind grain, its sails turning in the harbor breeze. Fields stretched northward, broken by orchards and pasture. The fort, however, remained the center of the settlement, its walls a reminder that the colony existed in a contested world. The Dutch did not come only for furs. They saw the land itself as valuable, and they encouraged farming through a system called the patroonship. Wealthy investors could claim vast estates along the river if they brought settlers to work the land. These patroonships created a patchwork of large farms and smaller plots, with tenant farmers laboring under the control of absentee landlords in Amsterdam. As the years passed, the rhythms of life in New Amsterdam grew more established. Children played in the narrow lanes, women tended gardens and baked bread in outdoor ovens, and men worked the docks, fields, and workshops. The sound of church bells rang across the village on Sundays, calling the faithful to the small wooden church within the fort's walls. Still, the settlement remained vulnerable. The English to the north and south eyed the Dutch holdings with interest, and conflicts in Europe spilled into the colonies. In 1643, tensions with the Lenape erupted into Kieft's War, a brutal conflict sparked by misunderstandings and poor leadership. The violence left deep scars on both sides and disrupted the fragile balance of trade. Despite these hardships, New Amsterdam persisted. By mid-century, its population included people from many corners of Europe and Africa. Enslaved Africans, brought by the company, worked in households, on farms, and in construction. Some were later granted partial freedom, forming a small free black community just north of the settlement. The streets of New Amsterdam were rarely quiet. Merchants shouted prices in the market square, sailors unloaded barrels of salted fish, and children darted between the legs of oxen pulling carts. The smell of tar, fresh bread, and the sea mingled in the air. Ships from the Caribbean brought sugar and rum, linking the colony to the wider currents of Atlantic trade. By the 1650s, the colony had outgrown its original palisade, and new walls were erected farther north, along the line where Wall Street would one day run. These defenses were meant to guard against attack, though they also marked the settlement's steady growth. Under Director General Peter Stuyvesant, appointed in 1647, New Amsterdam became more organized and more tightly controlled. Stuyvesant, with his wooden leg and stern manner, enforced moral order, improved fortifications, and expanded the settlement's infrastructure. He could be harsh, but he also left the colony more stable than he found it. By the early 1660s, New Amsterdam was a thriving, if small, port. Its population numbered only a few thousand, but it stood at the crossroads of trade routes stretching from Europe to the Caribbean, from the interior forests to the open sea. The Dutch flag flew over the fort, and the rhythms of the Netherlands could be heard in the accents of the streets. Yet change was coming again. Across the sea, England and the Netherlands were rivals in trade and power, and New Amsterdam was a tempting prize. Ships bearing the English flag would soon appear at the harbor's mouth, their presence signaling that the settlement's Dutch years were drawing to a close. For now, though, life continued as it had for decades. Ships docking at the pier, traders bargaining in the market, the tide rising and falling against the pilings. The little village at the tip of Manhattan had taken root, unaware that it was about to enter a new chapter under a different flag. Part 4. The British Takeover. The summer of 1664 began like many others in New Amsterdam. Merchants haggled in the market square, barrels rolled along the docks, and the sails of arriving ships brightened the harbor. The fort still stood at the southern tip of Manhattan, its wooden walls weathered by wind and salt, the Dutch flag lifting and falling with the breeze. Life moved in its usual rhythm, but far out to sea, events were in motion that would alter the colony's course forever. In London, England's ambitions were stretching across oceans. The The rivalry with the Dutch had been sharpening for years, not only in Europe but in the far reaches of their trading empires. The Hudson River, with its deep channel and access to the interior, was a jewel worth claiming. To English eyes, New Amsterdam's location at the meeting of river and sea was too valuable to leave in foreign hands. That summer, a small fleet of English warships crossed the Atlantic under the command of Colonel Richard Nichols. Their orders were direct: secure the Dutch settlement without delay. The fleet slipped quietly into the harbor in late August, their dark hulls and tall masts forming a line across the water. The appearance of the ships sent a shiver of unease through the town. Inside the fort, Director General Peter Stuyvesant received the news with grim determination. He was no stranger to threats, but the sight of English guns pointed toward the shore was different from the skirmishes of the past. The fort's walls were old, its cannons few, and the garrison was small. Stuyvesant called a council to decide whether to fight or surrender. Among the townspeople, opinions were divided. Some wanted to resist, clinging to the Dutch flag and their ties to the Netherlands. Others saw the English as a path to stability, perhaps even better trade. Many were weary of the Dutch West India Company's tight control and were wary of risking their homes and families in a battle they doubted they could win. The English, for their part, promised fair treatment if the town yielded without bloodshed. They offered to protect property rights, preserve religious freedom, and maintain existing laws until new arrangements could be made. These assurances carried weight in a settlement where Dutch, Walloon, English, African, and Jewish residents lived side by side. After days of tense negotiation, Stuyvesant bowed to the inevitable. On September 8, 1664, the Dutch flag was lowered over Fort Amsterdam, and the English colors rose in its place. The town was renamed New York, in honor of the Duke of York, brother to King Charles II, who had been granted the territory. The change in sovereignty was swift, but life in the streets did not stop. Markets reopened the next morning, ships continued to unload goods, and the sound of hammers carried from the shipyards. English officials moved into positions of authority, yet many of the Dutch customs and laws remained for a time. The transition was less about erasing the old than about layering the new over it. In the months that followed, the settlement began to take on more English traits. The English language became increasingly common in trade and government, though Dutch persisted in homes and churches. New York's legal system shifted toward English common law, and its ties to England's other colonies grew stronger. Ships from Boston and Virginia now came more frequently, carrying goods, news, and new settlers. The population was still small, fewer than 2,000, but it was diverse and growing. Africans, both enslaved and free, continued to work in the fields, on the docks, and in households. The Dutch Reformed Church remained active, joined by Anglican services in newly built spaces. The mingling of traditions gave the town a layered character, a mix of old and new influences that would define it for centuries. Beyond the town, the English encouraged settlement along Long Island, Staten Island, and up the Hudson River. Small farms took root in the fertile soil, and trade with the interior continued, though now under English authority. Beaver pelts, timber, and grain flowed to the docks, destined for England's markets. Not all accepted the change quietly. In 1673, during another war between England and the Netherlands, a Dutch fleet retook the city, raising their flag once more over the fort. But the victory was brief. The following year, the Treaty of Westminster ended the war and returned New York to English control. From that point on, the Dutch presence would remain in culture and memory, but English governance was secure. Under English rule, the settlement expanded steadily. Streets were widened and extended northward, following the natural contours of the island. The fort was rebuilt in stone, its new walls stronger against potential attack. A customs house stood near the docks, and warehouses lined the waterfront, storing goods bound for distant ports. By the early 18th century, New York had grown beyond its original walls. The population included English merchants, Dutch farmers, African laborers, and immigrants from France, Germany, and beyond. The markets were noisy with the calls of sellers offering fish, meat, bread, and imported goods. Carts rumbled over the cobblestones, and the smell of fresh-cut timber mingled with the salt air. The shift from Dutch to English rule had brought more than a new name. It had tied the settlement to the vast network of English colonies, linking it to the sugar islands of the Caribbean, the tobacco fields of Virginia, and the trading posts of Canada. New York's harbor became a hub for goods moving up and down the coast and across the ocean. Still, echoes of the Dutch years lingered. Family names, building styles, and certain customs endured long after the change of flags. The blend of influences gave the young city a character unlike any other in the colonies, a place both deeply rooted and open to the world. The British takeover was, in the end, less a single moment than the beginning of a long transformation. The settlement that had been New Amsterdam was now firmly part of England's empire, but its foundations remained those laid by Dutch hands. In the decades to come, New York would grow in size, wealth, and influence, until it became one of the most important cities in the English-speaking world. And yet, for those who had lived through the change, memories of the old flag, the old tongue, and the old ways persisted, quietly threading through the life of the new city. Part 5. A City in Revolution. By the middle of the 18th century, New York had grown into one of the most important ports in the British colonies. Ships arrived daily, their sails bright against the harbor's blue waters, carrying goods from the Caribbean, Europe, and other American ports. The streets were busier than ever, crowded with merchants, dock workers, and traders speaking in a dozen different accents. Yet beneath the hum of commerce, a quieter, more dangerous current was beginning to run through the city. The seeds of unrest had been planted long before the first shots of the American Revolution. Britain's wars in Europe and its growing empire had left the crown searching for revenue, and the colonies seemed a ready source. In New York, as in Boston and Philadelphia, laws passed in Parliament began to touch daily life in ways that many found intrusive. The Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, and later the Townshend duties imposed taxes on goods and legal documents, and though the sums were small, the principle was not. In taverns along the waterfront, arguments broke out over whether Parliament had the right to tax the colonies without their consent. The phrase "no taxation without representation" spread from one end of the city to the other. Some saw resistance as a dangerous gamble, certain to provoke the might of Britain's military. Others believed it was the only way to protect the liberties they felt were their birthright. The Sons of Liberty found fertile ground in New York. This loose network of merchants, artisans, and laborious organized protests and boycotts, sometimes peaceful, sometimes less so. Effigies of royal officials were hung from liberty poles, and British goods were burned in public demonstrations. Meetings drew crowds into the streets, where speakers denounced what they saw as tyranny. Not everyone in New York sided with the cause of independence. The city's ties to Britain were deep, especially among wealthy merchants whose fortunes depended on trade with London. Loyalists, those who favored remaining part of the British Empire, formed a strong presence in the city, and their influence reached into every level of society. This divide between patriots and loyalists would shape much of what followed. The tensions turned violent in 1770, when news of the Boston Massacre spread southward. In New York, protests intensified, and skirmishes between British soldiers and local residents became more frequent. Redcoats were a common sight in the streets, stationed there to maintain order but often seen as a provocation. In 1774, as Parliament passed the coercive acts to punish Boston for the Tea Party, delegates from the colonies gathered in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. New York sent representatives, though not without debate. The city's merchants worried about the risks of open defiance. When the Congress called for a boycott of British goods, the effects were felt immediately in New York's busy markets and on the piers where ships loaded and unloaded cargo. By 1775, the first shots had been fired in Massachusetts, and the colonies were at war. New York's location made it a prize for both sides. Its harbor offered one of the best anchorages on the Atlantic coast, and control of the Hudson River was seen as vital for moving troops and supplies. George Washington recognized this and moved quickly to secure the city for the Continental Army. In the summer of 1776, Washington and his troops arrived, setting up defenses in preparation for the British attack that everyone knew was coming. Fortifications rose along the waterfront, and cannon were placed to command the harbor. The Declaration of Independence was read aloud to cheering crowds, and for a brief moment, hope swelled that the city might stand free. That hope was short-lived. In late August, British forces under General William Howe landed on Long Island, defeating Washington's army in the largest battle of the war up to that point. The Continental troops retreated through Brooklyn and across the East River under cover of night, narrowly avoiding destruction. The British entered New York City in September, and they would hold it for the rest of the war. The occupation changed daily life overnight. Soldiers filled the streets, loyalists openly supported the crown, and many patriots fled, leaving homes and businesses behind. A devastating fire swept through the city just days after the British arrived, destroying hundreds of buildings and leaving much of the population homeless. Under British control, New York became a hub for military operations. The harbor was crowded with warships, and the fort once built by the Dutch was strengthened again. Prison ships anchored in Wallabout Bay held captured Americans in miserable conditions. Disease and starvation claimed thousands of lives. Still, resistance did not disappear. Spies for the Continental Army operated within the city, passing information through coded letters and invisible ink. One of the most famous, Nathan Hale, was captured and executed in 1776, remembered for declaring that he regretted he had but one life to lose for his country. Others, less well known, continued the dangerous work throughout the occupation. The war dragged on for years, with New York remaining a British stronghold. Only in 1783, after the signing of the Treaty of Paris, did the British finally depart. On November 25th of that year, known as Evacuation Day, Washington and his troops marched into the city to the cheers of the remaining patriots. The British flag was lowered, and the American flag was raised in its place. The revolution had left scars on New York, physical, economic, and personal. Whole neighborhoods had been destroyed by fire. Trade had been disrupted, and many families were divided by their loyalties. Yet the city began to rebuild quickly. Merchants reopened shops, ships returned to the harbor, and new buildings rose where ashes had been. In the years immediately following the war, New York took on a new role. For a brief time, it served as the capital of the young United States, hosting the first Congress under the Constitution in 1789. George Washington took the oath of office as the nation's first president on the balcony of Federal Hall, just steps from where Dutch traders had once sold beaver pelts. The Revolution had transformed New York from a colonial port into an American city, its fate now tied to the fortunes of the new republic. It was still a place of merchants and markets, of crowded streets and diverse voices, but it had also become a symbol, a place where independence had been won, lost, and finally secured. The years ahead would bring expansion, immigration, and waves of change that would reshape the city again and again. But in the memory of those who lived through it, the revolutionary years remained a defining time, when the streets echoed with both the footsteps of soldiers and the hopes of a people determined to chart their own future. Part 6. A New Nation's Capital. In the years following the British evacuation in 1783, New York City stood at a crossroads. The war had ended, but its imprint lingered in charred timbers, empty lots, and families fractured by divided loyalties. The smell of smoke and powder had long faded, yet memories of British occupation remained vivid in the minds of those who had endured it. Now, the city faced the challenge of rebuilding not just its streets and markets, but its identity within a new nation. Merchants wasted little time. Ships returned to the harbor, their holds filled with goods from the West Indies, Europe, and other American ports. The waterfront bustled once again with the sound of hammers on wooden hulls, sailors calling out as they unloaded barrels, and horses clattering over cobblestones hauling carts heavy with cargo. The city's location, perched between the Atlantic and the Hudson, gave it an advantage in the revival of trade. As commerce revived, politics began to stir. Under the Articles of Confederation, the young United States was still finding its footing. New York's leaders understood that the city's influence could grow if it became a center for national government. By 1785, that vision began to take shape when the Confederation Congress moved from Philadelphia to New York City, holding its sessions in the modest old City Hall at the corner of Wall and Nassau Streets. The presence of the nation's leaders changed the atmosphere. Delegates from the 13 states arrived by ship, carriage, or horseback, bringing with them the debates and ambitions of a country still defining itself. In the streets, one could hear conversations in accents from Virginia to New England, arguments about trade policy, currency, and foreign alliances. Taverns became informal meeting rooms, where the talk often lasted late into the night. Life in the city adjusted to this new political role. Tailors stitched fine coats for visiting statesmen, printers turned out pamphlets and broadsides discussing national issues, and boarding houses filled with lawmakers and their aides. The city's coffee houses, already hubs for merchants and traders, now played host to congressmen discussing treaties over steaming cups. In 1787, as delegates gathered in Philadelphia to draft a new constitution, New York remained a focal point for the political currents sweeping the country. Federalists in the city, including Alexander Hamilton, argued passionately for a stronger central government. Through essays, speeches, and private persuasion, they worked to win support for the document that would replace the Articles of Confederation. When the Constitution was ratified in 1788, New York City's role in the new federal government became even more significant. The following year, Congress designated the city as the first capital of the United States under the new system. Plans were quickly made to adapt the old City Hall into a space worthy of the new government. Architect Pierre Charles L'Enfant oversaw renovations that transformed the building into Federal Hall, complete with a grand balcony and a dignified interior for legislative sessions. On April 30, 1789, a crowd gathered in the streets below Federal Hall for a moment that would be etched into the nation's memory. George Washington, tall and solemn, stepped onto the balcony to take the oath of office as the first President of the United States. He placed his hand on a Bible held by Chancellor Robert Livingston, repeating the words that would set the precedent for every president to follow. The crowd erupted into cheers, church bells rang, and cannon boomed from the waterfront. The months that followed were a time of ceremony, diplomacy, and decision-making. The president's residence on Cherry Street became a center for official receptions, where guests dined on multi-course meals served on fine china while discussing the business of the new republic. In the evenings, oil lamps cast warm light on the polished wood of drawing rooms where senators, representatives, and foreign envoys mingled. The Capitol years also saw the beginnings of traditions that would endure. Congress established the Bill of Rights, shaping the liberties that would define the nation. The Judiciary Act created the federal court system. Debates in the House and Senate echoed through Federal Hall as lawmakers wrestled with questions of taxation, trade, and the nation's relationship with foreign powers. Beyond the halls of government, everyday life in New York continued with its own rhythm. Markets on Broad Street and Fly Market were busy from dawn, selling fish, meat, bread, and produce brought in from nearby farms. Street vendors cried their wares, from oysters to apples, while apprentices hurried along with baskets of goods. The sound of carriage wheels mingled with the calls of ferrymen on the East River, carrying passengers between Manhattan and Brooklyn. Yet the city's time as the national capital was brief. In 1790, political compromise shifted the seat of government to Philadelphia, with plans to establish a permanent capital on the banks of the Potomac. The departure of Congress and the president's household brought a quieter tone to New York's political scene, but it did not diminish its rising importance in trade and culture. If anything, the years as the capital had elevated the city's profile. Foreign merchants knew its name, and diplomats had walked its streets. Its role in launching the new government gave it a prestige that lingered long after the federal offices had moved south. The infrastructure built during those years, improved roads, public buildings, and an expanded port, laid the groundwork for further growth. In the decade that followed, New York began to look beyond politics to the opportunities of commerce and culture. New theaters opened, offering both imported plays and local productions. Bookshops displayed works from Europe alongside volumes printed in the city's own presses. Banks and insurance companies grew, providing the financial backbone for merchants whose ships sailed to the Caribbean, Europe, and Asia. The revolutionary scars were fading. The charred lots from the Great Fire during the British occupation were filled with new brick buildings. Churches rebuilt their spires. The population swelled as immigrants arrived from Ireland, Scotland, and Germany, drawn by the promise of work and a new life. Though its moment as the capital of the United States had passed, New York retained something even more valuable: a sense of itself as a place where history was made. The memory of Washington's oath, the First Congress, and the framing of foundational laws gave the city a role in the nation's story that could not be taken away. In the years ahead, that sense of possibility would fuel its transformation from a busy port into a metropolis, a place that looked outward to the world and inward to its own ambitions. The nation had moved on, but New York was just beginning its own climb toward becoming the capital of commerce, culture, and opportunity. Part 7. Immigrants by the Thousands. In the first decades of the 19th century, New York City stood on the edge of transformation. Its harbor, deep and sheltered, had already made it a hub for trade. Its merchants were prospering, banks were multiplying, and new buildings of brick and stone lined streets that only a generation before had been muddy lanes. But nothing would alter the city's character more profoundly than the tide of people soon to arrive from across the ocean. The first wave came from Ireland and Germany. For the Irish, the journey was driven by poverty, and in the 1840s, by the famine that devastated their homeland. Ships crowded with families left ports like Cork and Galway, bound for the promise of work and a better life. The passage was long and uncomfortable, weeks at sea in cramped quarters below deck. When they finally stepped onto the docks of Manhattan, they faced an unfamiliar city, one loud with street vendors, rattling carts, and the calls of sailors in half a dozen languages. Many Irish immigrants arrived with little money and took whatever work they could find. They dug canals, laid railroad tracks, and labored on the city's docks. Others worked as domestic servants, factory hands, or street sweepers. Their neighborhoods clustered in the poorer districts, where tenement houses rose quickly to meet the growing demand for shelter. Rooms were small and often crowded with more people than they were built to hold. The air was heavy with the smell of coal smoke, cooking, and the close press of bodies. The Germans who arrived in large numbers from the 1830s onward came for many reasons: economic opportunity, political freedom, and, for some, escape from the unrest that followed failed revolutions in Europe. They brought with them trades and skills, opening bakeries, breweries, and workshops. German-language newspapers appeared on street corners, and neighborhoods took on the feel of home with familiar food, music, and customs. The arrival of so many newcomers changed the city's sound and rhythm. Walking through the streets, one might hear Irish ballads from a tavern door, the strains of a German band in a park, and the call of an oyster vendor all within a few blocks. Markets filled with new kinds of bread, sausages, and produce. Churches multiplied, Catholic parishes to serve the Irish, Lutheran congregations for the Germans, each with its own festivals and traditions. But the swelling population brought challenges. Tenements were built hastily, often without proper ventilation or sanitation. Water was drawn from wells that could be easily contaminated, and outbreaks of disease were common. Cholera and yellow fever swept through the city in deadly waves, striking hardest in the poorest districts. Reformers began to push for cleaner water, better housing, and public health measures, but change came slowly. Not all residents welcomed the newcomers. Tensions flared between established citizens and immigrant communities, sometimes erupting into violence. Irish Catholics faced discrimination from Protestant nativists, who feared the influence of the Catholic Church and resented competition for jobs. Germans, too, found themselves targeted, particularly when their political ideas or customs clashed with the dominant culture. Yet for all the friction, immigration continued to reshape New York. By mid-century, the city was one of the most diverse in the world, its streets a living map of Europe. And still more arrivals were on the horizon. In 1855, the city opened Castle Garden, a reception depot at the tip of Manhattan, to process the growing tide of immigrants. Here, arrivals were registered, offered information, and sometimes helped to find work or lodging. It was a first glimpse of the organized, if crowded, welcome that would later define Ellis Island. Families passed through its halls with bundles in hand, their eyes fixed on the streets beyond. The scale of change was staggering. Between 1820 and 1860, millions came through New York's harbor, and many stayed. Whole districts transformed almost overnight. The Bowery, once a genteel neighborhood, became a working-class center, lined with boarding houses, beer halls, and theaters. The Lower East Side filled with tenements, their windows spilling light into the streets at night as neighbors talked from one sill to another. The Civil War years brought another shift. Immigration slowed during the conflict, but when it resumed, it did so with renewed force. Scandinavians, Italians, and Eastern European Jews began to join the flow, each bringing their own languages, foods, and traditions. By the late 19th century, steamships had replaced sailing vessels, cutting the journey to a week or less. This made the passage faster, but it also meant ships could carry more passengers, and the volume of arrivals climbed sharply. In 1892, Ellis Island opened in the shadow of the Statue of Liberty, which had been dedicated only 6 years earlier. For millions, this would be their first step on American soil. The Great Hall of the immigration station was filled with voices, some anxious, some joyful, as officials examined papers, checked health, and asked questions through interpreters. From there, many boarded ferries to Manhattan, carrying with them the hope that the city would offer what they had crossed oceans to find. Each new wave altered the city's character further. Italians settled in areas that became known as Little Italy, filling them with the smell of baking bread and simmering tomato sauce. Jewish immigrants from Russia and Poland opened tailor shops, synagogues, and small factories, crowding into the dense Lower East Side. Chinese arrivals, though fewer in number due to restrictive laws, built a small but vibrant Chinatown along Mart and Pell Streets. The city's economy grew with its population. Immigrants filled the factories that churned out garments, cigars, and machinery. They worked on the streetcars, in the markets, and in the booming construction industry that was beginning to push buildings higher into the sky. Newspapers flourished, printed in English, German, Yiddish, and Italian, each serving its own readership. For all its hardships, the crowded housing, the prejudice, the uncertainty, New York offered something rare, a place where the past could be left behind, and the future could be shaped by hard work and determination. The streets might be noisy and unpaved, the air thick with smoke, but to many who arrived, it was still a place of possibility. By the turn of the 20th century, more than 2/3 of New York's residents were foreign-born or the children of immigrants. The city had become a mosaic, each piece distinct but together forming something larger, more complex, and more resilient than any one community alone. The harbor that had once welcomed a single small Dutch ship now received vessels carrying thousands at a time, and the skyline they approached was beginning to rise in steel and stone. The immigrant tide had not just changed New York, it had become its defining force. In the neighborhoods, in the markets, in the very sound of its streets, the city carried the voices of the world. And in the decades to come, those voices would help lift it toward its next transformation, into the modern metropolis that would call itself the capital of the world. Part 8. The Gilded Age. By the final decades of the 19th century, New York City had become a place of extremes. The harbor was busier than ever, its waters crowded with steamships arriving from distant ports, carrying cargo and people in equal measure. The streets near the piers teemed with draymen hauling goods, vendors calling out their prices, and new arrivals pushing through the crush with bundles in hand. Above the noise, the skyline itself was beginning to change. Steel skeletons rose into the air, a new kind of architecture that promised to lift the city higher than it had ever imagined. This was the Gilded Age, a period named for its glittering surface, a time of immense wealth and opulence for a few, and deep hardship for many. The city's economy surged forward on the power of finance, industry, and trade. Banks clustered around Wall Street, their stone facades meant to inspire confidence and awe. The stock exchange hummed with activity, the shouted bids of brokers echoing through its crowded floor. Industrialists and financiers amassed fortunes on a scale previously unknown in America. Names like Vanderbilt, Astor, and Morgan became synonymous with power. They built palatial mansions along Fifth Avenue, each vying to outshine the next with marble columns, gilded interiors, and imported art. In ballrooms lit by crystal chandeliers, guests in silk and satin danced late into the night while orchestras played. The wealth on display seemed limitless. Beyond these grand houses, the city's cultural institutions flourished. The Metropolitan Museum of Art expanded its collections, drawing donations from wealthy patrons eager to leave their mark on the city's legacy. The New York Public Library began to take shape, intended as a monument to learning. Theaters along Broadway staged both imported productions and homegrown plays, while the opera houses welcomed Europe's finest voices. Yet just a few miles from the glitter of Fifth Avenue, a different New York existed. In the Lower East Side, tenement buildings stood shoulder to shoulder, their brick walls weathered and their narrow courtyards choked with laundry lines. Rooms meant for one family often held 2 or 3. The streets were crowded from dawn until late at night, filled with pushcarts selling everything from pickles to shoelaces. The scent of coal smoke, fried food, and refuse mingled in the air. For the working poor, the Gilded Age was a time of relentless labor. Men toiled in garment factories, foundries, and shipyards for long hours and low pay. Women worked as seamstresses, laundresses, or servants. Children often joined them, selling newspapers, shining shoes, or working in workshops despite growing calls for child labor reform. The contrast between rich and poor was stark and visible. A carriage rolling up Fifth Avenue might pass ragged children picking through ash barrels for scraps of coal. Newspapers and reformers began to draw attention to the city's social divide, publishing photographs and reports that shocked those who had never ventured beyond their own neighborhoods. Jacob Riis's How the Other Half Lives exposed the harsh realities of tenement life, sparking debates about housing reform and sanitation. Public works projects sought to address some of the city's challenges. The construction of the Brooklyn Bridge, completed in 1883, connected Manhattan and Brooklyn in a feat of engineering that became a symbol of progress. Its soaring towers and web of cables transformed the skyline and made daily life easier for thousands who crossed between the boroughs. Parks expanded under the vision of designers like Frederick Law Olmsted, whose Central Park offered a green refuge from the city's relentless pace. Transportation itself was changing. Elevated railways clattered above the streets, their iron tracks carrying trains from the Battery to Harlem. Electric streetlights began to replace gas lamps, casting a new glow over nighttime streets. Department stores such as Macy's and Lord & Taylor offered a new kind of shopping experience, their large windows filled with displays meant to entice passers-by. Immigration continued to feed the city's growth. Italians, Eastern European Jews, and other newcomers added to the cultural mosaic, bringing their languages, traditions, and cuisines. Neighborhoods became known for their distinctive character. Little Italy with its cafes and open-air markets, the Jewish Quarter with its Yiddish theaters and kosher bakeries. The city was becoming not just larger, but more complex. Labor unrest simmered beneath the surface of progress. Strikes erupted in factories and on the docks as workers demanded better pay, shorter hours, and safer conditions. The labor movement gained strength, and socialist and anarchist ideas found an audience among those who felt shut out of the Gilded Age's promise. These tensions sometimes flared into violence, drawing police and headlines. Still, the city's momentum seemed unstoppable. New York's port handled more goods than any other in the nation, and its banks and businesses set the pace for the country's economy. Cultural life thrived alongside commerce, and even the poorest neighborhoods buzzed with energy, their streets alive with music, conversation, and enterprise. By the dawn of the 20th century, New York had become the largest city in the United States, its population swelled by millions of immigrants and migrants. The Gilded Age had left its mark in the steel of its bridges, the stone of its mansions, and the ambitions of its people. It had shown what wealth could build, and what inequality could hide. For some, it was an era of achievement to be celebrated. For others, a reminder of the work still to be done. But for all who walked its streets, the Gilded Age had been a chapter of transformation, a time when the city learned how high it could rise, and how deep its divisions could run. Part 9. The Roaring Twenties. When the First World War ended in 1918, New York City stood at a turning point. The war had brought industry, jobs, and a steady influx of people, but it had also left the nation restless, eager for change. In the decade that followed, the city became a place where optimism and energy seemed to pulse through the very streets. The 1920s opened with a skyline that was already climbing higher than anyone had imagined. New buildings of steel and glass rose along the avenues, each one a testament to the city's growing confidence. Construction cranes dotted the horizon, their long arms swinging over busy streets as crews worked day and night. The hum of the subway and the rattle of elevated trains carried people to jobs, theaters, and nightclubs. Economic prosperity touched much of the city, though not all equally. Wall Street surged with speculation, the stock exchange floor a frenzy of shouted orders and clanging bells. The canyons of Lower Manhattan filled with bankers, brokers, and clerks in crisp suits, their briefcases swinging as they hurried between appointments. In contrast, the laborers who built the city's towers often worked without safety nets, their silhouettes balanced on narrow steel beams high above the streets. Prohibition, enacted in 1920, was meant to end the sale of alcohol, but in New York it seemed only to change the way people drank. Speakeasies, secret bars hidden behind unmarked doors or beneath ordinary storefronts, flourished. Inside, jazz music filled the air, glasses clinked, and conversation flowed freely. Bartenders mixed gin cocktails under the soft light of shaded lamps, and the city's nightlife developed a rhythm all its own. Nowhere was the city's cultural energy more visible than in Harlem. The Harlem Renaissance brought together writers, musicians, painters, and intellectuals in a celebration of African American creativity. Clubs like the Cotton Club and the Savoy Ballroom became famous for their music and dance floors, drawing audiences from every part of the city. The sound of jazz, horns bright, drums quick, spilled out into the streets, mingling with the scent of late-night meals and the laughter of crowds. Literature, too, found a home in this decade. Writers gathered in cafes and apartments to exchange ideas and read their work aloud. Magazines published poetry and essays that challenged conventions, while bookstores displayed new novels that captured the spirit of the time. The city seemed to invite boldness, in art, in music, and in life. For those with money, the decade was a time of luxury. Department stores on Fifth Avenue offered silk dresses, tailored suits, and imported goods from Europe. Automobiles, once rare, became a common sight, their polished bodies gleaming in the sun as they rolled along newly paved roads. Rooftop gardens atop hotels hosted evening dances, their lights twinkling against the skyline. Yet even in this era of glamour, many struggled. Immigrant neighborhoods remained crowded, with families sharing small apartments and working long hours in factories or shops. The divide between rich and poor, masked at times by the city's outward sparkle, still shaped everyday life. Reformers continued to push for better housing, fair wages, and safer working conditions. Sports added another layer to the decade's excitement. Yankee Stadium opened in 1923, becoming the new home of Babe Ruth and a team that would soon dominate baseball. Boxing matches drew huge crowds, and radio broadcasts brought games and events to those who couldn't attend in person. The city's appetite for entertainment seemed boundless. The skyline reached new heights before the decade's end. The Chrysler Building began to rise in 1928, its stainless steel crown designed to catch the morning light. Across town, plans for the Empire State Building were already underway. These structures were more than office space. They were symbols of ambition, meant to declare that New York could match or surpass any city in the world. Beneath the optimism, however, there were signs of fragility. The stock market's relentless climb was built on speculation, and whispers of instability circulated in financial circles. Most New Yorkers paid little attention to these warnings, caught up in the pace and pleasure of the moment. The city felt unstoppable, as if the rhythm of its growth could only continue. As the decade drew to a close, the streets were still filled with music, the theaters still crowded, and the sense of possibility still alive. But in October 1929, the roar would quiet. The crash of the stock market would send shockwaves through Wall Street, close businesses, and change lives overnight. The city that had danced through the 1920s would soon face a very different reality, one defined not by champagne and jazz, but by breadlines and uncertainty. For now, though, the Roaring Twenties remained a memory of light and sound, of nights that seemed endless, and of a city that believed it could shape the future simply by moving forward at full speed. Part 10. Depression and Recovery. The end of the 1920s came with a shudder. On an October morning in 1929, the confident rhythm of Wall Street faltered, then collapsed entirely. The stock market crash sent shockwaves through New York City that rippled outward across the nation. In a matter of days, fortunes vanished, businesses folded, and the unshakable optimism of the Roaring Twenties gave way to fear. At first, many believed the downturn would pass quickly. New York had weathered recessions before, and there was hope this was only another passing storm. But as weeks turned into months, the reality deepened. Banks failed, taking with them the savings of thousands. The once crowded trading floor of the New York Stock Exchange felt different now, less frantic, more desperate, the calls of traders sharp and urgent rather than buoyant. On the streets, the change was visible. Men in worn coats stood on corners holding signs offering to work for food. Shop windows that had once displayed silks and jewelry now stood empty, their owners unable to pay the rent. In poorer neighborhoods, families doubled up in apartments, pooling resources to survive. Even in wealthier districts, the air of certainty had thinned. Some of the grand mansions on Fifth Avenue were quietly sold, their owners unable to sustain the cost. Unemployment climbed sharply. Factories closed or cut back production, and the docks along the Hudson saw fewer ships arrive. The once steady hum of industry faltered into silence in many places. Bread lines formed outside churches and charitable kitchens, winding along sidewalks in the cold. Men, women, and children waited patiently for a bowl of soup or a piece of bread, a dignity preserved only by the shared knowledge that no one in line was alone in their hardship. Yet even in this dark period, the city's resilience began to show. Communities organized relief efforts, neighbors shared what they had, and small acts of kindness multiplied. Musicians still played on street corners, perhaps for coins, perhaps simply to lift the spirits of passers-by. Markets still bustled, though now the bargaining was more urgent, the coins more carefully counted. The arrival of Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal in the early 1930s brought a new kind of energy. Federal programs began to funnel money into public works projects, and New York became a proving ground for the idea that government could help restore hope. Construction sites once again filled with workers. Bridges, schools, post offices, and parks took shape under the hands of men and women glad to have a steady wage. One of the most visible signs of this recovery effort was the rise of the Triborough Bridge, linking Manhattan, Queens, and the Bronx in an ambitious feat of engineering. Robert Moses, the city's powerful parks commissioner, oversaw the project along with countless others. New playgrounds, swimming pools, and roadways designed to prepare the city for the future. Culture, too, found ways to endure and adapt. Broadway theaters faced lean years, but some managed to keep their doors open, offering discounted tickets or lighter fare to audiences hungry for distraction. Radio grew into a dominant force, bringing music, drama, and news into homes across the city. Sports continued to offer a welcome escape. Baseball fans still cheered at Yankee Stadium, where the roar of the crowd could briefly drown out the worries of daily life. Art took on new forms. Murals funded by the Works Progress Administration brightened public buildings, celebrating the dignity of labor and the city's history. Photographers documented both the hardship and the resilience of New Yorkers, capturing images that would come to define the era. By the mid-1930s, small signs of recovery were visible. Shops reopened, hiring signs appeared in windows, and the flow of people on the sidewalks grew steadier. The completion of the Empire State Building in 1931, begun before the crash, stood as both a reminder of earlier ambition and a beacon of what might be possible again. Though it opened in the depths of the Depression and initially struggled to fill its offices, its spire still caught the sunlight each morning, an unspoken promise that the city would rise again. The World's Fair of 1939 offered another burst of optimism. Held in Flushing Meadows, Queens, it was billed as the World of Tomorrow and featured gleaming pavilions, futuristic designs, and exhibits celebrating innovation. For visitors weary of the grind of the Depression, it was a glimpse into a brighter, more hopeful future. Families wandered the fairgrounds, marveling at television broadcasts, streamlined trains, and visions of cities with wide, green boulevards. Still, the decade closed with the world once again on the brink of war. Europe's tensions were rising, and the United States, though not yet involved, was already beginning to feel the pull of global events. In New York, the lessons of the Depression lingered, the memory of loss, the understanding of how fragile prosperity could be, and the recognition of the strength that came from community. The city had endured years of scarcity and fear, yet it had also learned to adapt. It had built, created, and found ways to keep moving forward when standing still was not an option. As the 1940s approached, New York was not the same city that had danced through the 1920s. It was leaner, wiser, and perhaps more determined than ever to shape its own future, whatever that future might hold. Part 11. The War Years. When war returned to the world in 1939, New York City was already alert to the shifting winds. Though the United States remained officially neutral in those first years, the city's harbor, banks, and factories began to move in step with the growing demands of conflict. Ships bearing goods for Britain and other allies slipped out past the Statue of Liberty, their holds filled with steel, grain, and machinery. On the waterfront, the cranes never seemed to stop moving. The attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 changed everything. Overnight, the war was no longer something happening across oceans. It was an urgent, all-consuming reality. The city threw itself into the fight with an energy unmatched since the First World War. Recruiters set up offices in post buildings, and long lines formed as young men enlisted. Posters appeared in shop windows and on subway walls urging citizens to buy war bonds, conserve materials, and do their part. New York's position as the nation's largest port made it a lifeline for the war effort. The Brooklyn Navy Yard became one of the busiest shipbuilding facilities in the country. Thousands of workers, men and women alike, built and repaired warships around the clock. Welding torches lit the docks day and night, their sparks falling like brief showers of light against the dark hulls of battleships and carriers. Factories across the city shifted production to military needs. Garment workers sewed uniforms, machine shops turned out parts for aircraft, and printing presses produced maps, manuals, and propaganda. On the streets, the sight of women in coveralls and work boots became common as Rosie the Riveter stepped from the posters into real life. The war also brought a new rhythm to daily life. Rationing began in 1942, with books of stamps dictating how much sugar, coffee, meat, and gasoline each household could purchase. People adapted quickly, sharing recipes that made do with less, walking or taking public transit to save fuel, and growing vegetables in backyard or community gardens. The city's parks and vacant lots sprouted rows of tomatoes, beans, and lettuce, small contributions to a vast collective effort. In Times Square, news of battles and victories flashed across the famous electric signs. Crowds gathered to watch the latest updates, cheering at reports of Allied advances or holding their breath at news of losses. Newspapers sold out within hours, their front pages carrying photographs from Europe and the Pacific. The radio became a constant companion, delivering both the grim realities of war and moments of hope through speeches, music, and entertainment. The city's cultural life, though altered, did not stop. Broadway staged patriotic productions alongside lighter fare meant to lift spirits. Jazz clubs remained lively, often packed with soldiers on leave looking for a few hours of escape. Dances were held in armories and community halls, the floor crowded with uniforms and dresses as bands played swing tunes. New York also became a place of farewells. The piers along the Hudson were the last sight of home for countless troops shipping out to war. Families gathered to wave from the docks, their faces pressed together in final embraces before the long separation. The Statue of Liberty stood in the background, its torch raised over the departing convoys. The city was not untouched by the dangers of war. German U-boats prowled the Atlantic, sinking ships close enough to the coast that their burning silhouettes could sometimes be seen from shore. Blackout drills were conducted, with lights dimmed and windows covered to prevent the glow from guiding enemy aircraft or submarines. Air raid wardens patrolled neighborhoods to ensure compliance, their whistles and flashlights cutting through the dark. For many, the war years were a time of intense personal change. Women entered professions they had never been part of before. African American workers pushed for fair treatment in defense industries, and immigrant communities demonstrated their patriotism through service and sacrifice. The city became a microcosm of the national shifts in labor, civil rights, and gender roles. By 1944, the tide of war had begun to turn. News of Allied landings in Normandy brought enormous crowds into the streets. Flags appeared in every window, and victory seemed at last within reach. Yet the cost was never far from mind. Gold stars hung in the windows of homes that had lost loved ones, and telegrams from the War Department were feared as much as they were dreaded. When victory in Europe was declared in May 1945, New York erupted. Times Square filled with people until it seemed no space remained. Strangers embraced, sailors kissed nurses, confetti fell from office windows, and church bells rang across the boroughs. The celebration was tempered only by the knowledge that the war in the Pacific was still raging. That final chapter closed in August, after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki brought Japan to surrender. Again, the city poured into the streets, the joy mingled with relief and exhaustion. Troops began to return, their ships docking where they had once departed, and reunions played out on the same piers that had seen so many farewells. The war left New York changed. Its industries had grown, its role on the world stage had expanded, and its population had been bound together in a shared effort unlike anything before. Yet it also carried the weight of loss, the memories of sacrifice, and the understanding that the world had entered a new and uncertain age. In the years ahead, New York would channel its wartime momentum into peacetime growth. The skills, connections, and infrastructure built during those years would fuel a new chapter, one in which the city would rise to a position of global influence unlike any it had known before. Part 12. Skyscraper City. The end of the Second World War brought with it a feeling unlike anything New York had experienced before. The city had celebrated victory in the streets, but once the confetti had been swept away and the parades had passed, something deeper remained, a sense that the world had shifted and that New York stood at its center. The war had left the city's industries humming, its population swelling, and its port busier than ever. Troops returning home stepped off ships into the arms of loved ones, their uniforms creased from long voyages, their eyes scanning the skyline they had dreamed of while overseas. For many, that skyline looked different than they remembered. New buildings had risen during the war years, and still more were planned. Cranes moved along the waterfront, and scaffolding clung to structures climbing skyward. The era of the modern skyscraper was entering full stride. In the heart of Manhattan, the Empire State Building, completed in 1931, now stood as a symbol of resilience. Though it had opened in the depths of the Depression, often called the Empty State Building for its unleased flaws, the post-war years began to fill it with tenants. Its spire pierced the sky, lit at night as a beacon visible for miles. It had become more than an office building. It was a statement of ambition, of the city's belief that no height was unreachable. The skyline, however, would not remain static. In the years immediately after the war, a wave of construction swept across Midtown and Lower Manhattan. Modernist designs replaced older brick and stone facades, their sleek lines reflecting the confidence of a new era. Steel frames and curtain walls of glass gave the city a look that felt forward-facing, as though the streets themselves were gazing toward the future. Economically, New York emerged from the war in a position of extraordinary strength. Wall Street, already the financial heart of the nation, began to exert influence globally. Banks expanded their reach, insurance companies grew, and the stock exchange became a symbol of American economic might. Each morning, brokers streamed through the neoclassical facade of the exchange, their steps quick, their conversations urgent. The trading floor, crowded with men in dark suits, was a world of its own, its language one of hand signals, shouted bids, and flashing numbers. The port, too, remained a vital artery. Cargo ships docked along the Hudson and East Rivers, their cranes swinging crates of goods from every corner of the globe. New York's location and infrastructure made it a hub for imports and exports, feeding not only its own economy but the nation's. Warehouses bustled, longshoremen worked in teams, and freight trains carried goods inland. Culturally, the city was unrivaled. Broadway theaters reopened in full force after wartime slowdowns, drawing audiences with musicals, dramas, and comedies that would become classics. The glow of the theater district's lights at night spoke of vitality and escape, the marquees announcing new shows that seemed to appear every season. Jazz clubs still pulsed in Harlem, but now they were joined by a growing variety of music venues downtown, where bebop and cool jazz attracted both musicians and devoted listeners. Village coffee houses began to fill with poets and folk singers, their voices adding new threads to the city's soundtrack. The arts flourished in another way as well. In 1946, the United Nations chose New York as its permanent home. The decision underscored the city's position as an international crossroads. On the East River, construction began on the UN headquarters, a sleek, modern complex of glass and steel that would soon host delegates from around the globe. Flags from every nation would fly along its approach, a daily reminder to New Yorkers that their city was now the stage for world diplomacy. Housing, however, became one of the city's first major post-war challenges. The return of millions of servicemen, coupled with continued immigration and migration from rural America, meant demand far outstripped supply. Apartment buildings filled quickly, and waiting lists for new units stretched for months or years. To meet the need, large-scale housing projects rose across the boroughs. Some, like the Stuyvesant Town Peter Cooper Village development, offered modern apartments and green spaces for middle-income families. Others were public housing complexes built by the city to provide affordable homes, though often in stark, uniform designs that reflected the era's utilitarian approach. Transportation adapted to the growing population. The subway system, already vast, expanded further into the outer boroughs, carrying workers from Queens, Brooklyn, and the Bronx into Manhattan each day. Buses and ferries kept the city's neighborhoods connected, while the bridges, Brooklyn, Manhattan, Williamsburg, and Queensboro, carried streams of traffic that seemed never to pause. In the midst of this growth, a new architectural vision began to dominate. The post-war skyscraper was taller, sleeker, and more technologically advanced than its predecessors. Buildings like the Lever House, completed in 1952, and the Seagram Building in 1958 embraced clean lines and open plazas, setting a new standard for corporate architecture. Their glass facades reflected the sky by day and glowed softly by night, changing the way New Yorkers experienced their own skyline. These towers were not built simply to house offices. They were statements of identity for the companies within, each meant to signal stability, power, and modernity. Inside, air-conditioned interiors and fluorescent lighting replaced the stuffier, darker offices of earlier decades. Lobbies became showcases for art and design, with marble floors, sculptural seating, and abstract murals. The rise of Midtown as a business district accelerated. While Wall Street remained the symbolic and practical center of finance, companies increasingly chose to locate their headquarters closer to Grand Central Terminal and the new office towers along Park Avenue. This shift brought a different kind of energy to Midtown, blending commerce with proximity to cultural institutions, hotels, and high-end shopping. Retail, too, reached new heights in the post-war years. Department stores became destinations in themselves. Macy's, Lord & Taylor, and Saks Fifth Avenue offered everything from luxury gowns to kitchen appliances, drawing shoppers from the suburbs as well as from across the 5 boroughs. Elaborate holiday window displays became annual events, with crowds pressing against the glass to see the moving figures and winter scenes. Television joined the mix of influences reshaping New York. Broadcast studios clustered in Midtown, producing programs that would be watched across the nation. Stars of the new medium could be seen entering stage doors, their faces familiar to viewers from coast to coast. The city's streets and landmarks began to appear regularly on television screens, making New York's image part of the national imagination. Yet for all the glamour and growth, challenges persisted. Poverty still gripped certain neighborhoods, and racial segregation, though often less formal than in the South, remained a reality in housing, employment, and education. Civil rights activists worked to address these inequities, and the city became an important site for protest and advocacy. By the late 1950s, New York had entered a period where its physical shape, cultural influence, and economic reach all pointed toward something undeniable. It had become the closest thing the modern world had to a capital of the world. The skyscrapers rising above its streets were not just places of business, they were symbols recognized across continents. At night, the skyline told its own story. From the decks of ships entering the harbor or from planes descending toward LaGuardia or Idlewild Airport, the lights appeared first as a soft glow, then as a dazzling field of gold and white. The Empire State Building, the Chrysler Building, and newer towers alike stood illuminated against the dark sky, a constellation built by human hands. The United Nations headquarters, with its distinctive slab of glass, stood at the edge of the East River, its lights often burning late as diplomats debated matters of peace and war. Along Broadway, theaters sent their own glow into the night, marquees lit with the names of actors and productions. Jazz and conversation spilled from clubs, while diners served late-night coffee to shift workers, travelers, and dreamers alike. It was in these years that New York's identity as a skyscraper city solidified, not just a place of tall buildings, but a place where height itself became a kind of language. To build higher was to assert ambition, to take a place in the conversation of the city. Each new tower altered the skyline, but also joined a shared vision that was part competition, part collaboration. As the 1960s approached, there was no sign of this momentum slowing. In the minds of many who walked its streets, the city's skyline was still unfinished, a work in progress, always reaching upward, always redefining itself. The war had ended, but the drive it had awakened in New York to be the center of commerce, culture, and diplomacy showed no signs of fading. The cranes would keep moving, the glass would keep reflecting the sun, and the city, true to its nature, would keep building toward the sky. Part 13. The Turbulent 70s. By the dawn of the 1970s, New York City's skyline still glimmered with ambition. From a distance, whether seen from the deck of the Staten Island ferry, the curve of the Brooklyn Heights promenade, or the window of a jetliner descending toward Kennedy Airport, the sight was as breathtaking as ever. The Empire State Building still commanded the Midtown horizon, the United Nations Tower still reflected the light off the East River, and newer office blocks had joined the forest of glass and steel. But to those walking its streets, the mood was shifting. The 1960s had left the city at a crossroads. It had been a decade of expansion, political upheaval, and cultural brilliance, but also of mounting costs, deepening inequality, and the first signs of economic strain. By the early years of the new decade, the cracks beneath the polished skyline were becoming harder to ignore. An economy under strain. The city's finances, once buoyed by post-war prosperity, were beginning to falter. Manufacturing, long the backbone of employment for working-class New Yorkers, was in steep decline. Garment factories that had hummed in the loft buildings of Midtown and the Lower East Side were shuttering as production moved to other states or overseas. The shipyards along the Brooklyn waterfront, once vital to the war effort, saw fewer contracts. On the piers, longshoremen faced shorter shifts as containerization changed the shipping industry, moving freight to more modern ports in New Jersey and leaving Manhattan's once bustling docks quieter than anyone could remember. Tax revenues shrank even as the city's obligations grew. Social programs expanded to address poverty, unemployment, and housing needs, but the funds to support them lagged behind. New York borrowed heavily to keep services running, pushing its budget deeper into the red with each passing year. Changing neighborhoods. The population itself was shifting. Middle-class families, especially white ones, were leaving for the suburbs in what newspapers called white flight. They sought quieter streets, newer schools, and lower taxes outside the city's limits. In their place, new waves of immigrants arrived from the Caribbean, Latin America, and Asia, bringing energy, languages, and cultural traditions that would reshape the city's identity. Neighborhoods reflected these changes in vivid ways. In Washington Heights, Spanish-language signs appeared in shop windows, and the smell of Dominican cooking drifted from corner restaurants. Queens saw an influx of Korean, Chinese, and Indian families, transforming local business strips into vibrant, multilingual markets. In Brooklyn, West Indian festivals brought color and music to the streets, even as other blocks showed the wear of disinvestment and neglect. These changes enriched the city's culture but also strained its infrastructure. Schools overflowed, public housing faced mounting maintenance needs, and transportation systems groaned under the load. The subway, once a marvel of efficiency, was becoming unreliable. Delays, graffiti-covered cars, and aging tracks became part of the daily commute. Crime and perception. As the economy stumbled, crime rates rose. The causes were many: poverty, unemployment, the availability of drugs, and strained police resources. But the effect on public perception was immediate. Muggings in Central Park, burglaries in residential neighborhoods, and shootings in poorer districts filled the headlines. The city's image in national media darkened, and for those who lived there, the sense of unease seeped into everyday routines. Graffiti, once seen as a rebellious form of self-expression, spread rapidly through the transit system. Entire subway cars were covered in elaborate tags and murals, making the trains themselves moving canvases. For some, it was art. For others, it was evidence of decline. Riding the subway at night became something many avoided if they could. Times Square, still home to theaters and bright lights, was also changing. The rise of adult entertainment venues, peep shows, and street hustlers gave the district a reputation that made families think twice before visiting after dark. Tourists still came, drawn by the neon and the promise of Broadway, but they walked quickly, their eyes scanning the crowds. Fiscal crisis. By the mid-1970s, the city's financial troubles reached a breaking point. In 1975, New York faced the possibility of bankruptcy, a prospect that seemed unthinkable for what had long been considered the nation's economic engine. Years of borrowing to cover budget gaps had caught up, and investors began to refuse the city's bonds. Bills piled up, and there was talk of massive layoffs, service cuts, and the closing of entire departments. Mayor Abraham Beame, a bookkeeper by training, found himself at the center of the storm. He appealed to the federal government for help, only to be met with initial refusal. The Daily News captured the mood with its now famous headline, "Ford to City, Drop Dead." Though President Gerald Ford never used those words, the sentiment was clear. Washington was reluctant to bail out what it saw as a financially reckless city. It took a combination of state intervention, new fiscal oversight, and eventually federal loan guarantees to pull New York back from the brink. But the rescue came with a price: deep cuts to public services, layoffs of city workers, and a hard look at how the city managed its money. The scars of that near collapse would linger for years. Everyday life amid turmoil. For ordinary New Yorkers, the turbulence of the 1970s was lived in small, daily moments. The subway still ran, but riders might find themselves stuck between stations for unexplained stretches of time. Streets were still full, but more shops were closed, their metal gates rolled down and padlocked. Garbage piled up faster than sanitation crews could clear it, especially during strikes. Yet in the midst of hardship, the city's cultural life refused to fade. Music scenes flourished in unlikely places. In the Bronx, block parties and community gatherings gave birth to hip-hop, with DJs like Kool Herc using turntables and sound systems to create new rhythms from old records. In downtown clubs, punk rock exploded, its raw energy and defiant spirit a counterpoint to the city's gloom. Disco, with its shimmering beats and glamorous dance floors, turned places like Studio 54 into temporary escapes from the era's worries. Art found new homes in abandoned spaces. Loft buildings in Soho, once home to factories, became studios for painters, sculptors, and photographers. Murals brightened otherwise neglected walls, and experimental theater thrived in small venues on shoestring budgets. The creativity of the 1970s was often born from the very constraints the city faced, a determination to make something vibrant in the face of decline. Moments of resilience. Even as headlines painted a picture of a city in trouble, acts of resilience unfolded every day. Neighborhood block associations organized cleanups and planted community gardens in vacant lots. Cultural festivals celebrated the heritage of immigrant communities, drawing crowds from across the boroughs. Sports offered shared moments of pride. The Yankees, under manager Billy Martin, brought baseball excitement back to the Bronx, while the Knicks kept Madison Square Garden alive with the sound of roaring fans. One of the most symbolic moments came in 1977, during the city's blackout in July. A lightning strike upstate triggered a massive power outage, plunging all of New York into darkness. In some neighborhoods, the night brought looting and arson, with fires lighting the sky and shop windows smashed open. In others, people sat on stoops with candles, sharing food and conversation until the lights returned. The blackout became a symbol of the decade itself, a mix of danger, vulnerability, and unexpected community spirit. The Twin Towers rise. Amid all this turbulence, construction continued on one of the most ambitious projects in the city's history, the World Trade Center. The Twin Towers, rising from the edge of Lower Manhattan, took years to complete. Their design was controversial to some, their scale staggering to all. By the time they opened in the early 1970s, the towers had redefined the skyline. Standing side by side, they seemed to declare that New York, despite its troubles, was still capable of thinking on a monumental scale. The plaza between the towers, with its fountains and open space, became a meeting point for workers and visitors. The observation deck, hundreds of feet above the streets, offered a view of the entire city and beyond, a reminder of the scope and complexity of the metropolis below. End of the decade. By the close of the 1970s, the city was still wrestling with the same challenges that had defined the decade: crime, economic uncertainty, and the struggle to balance its books. But there were glimmers of change. The fiscal crisis had forced reforms in budgeting and oversight, and some neighborhoods were beginning to stabilize. Tourism, though smaller than in past decades, persisted, and the city's cultural reputation remained magnetic to artists, musicians, and dreamers. The 1970s had left New York with a reputation, sometimes deserved, sometimes exaggerated, as dangerous, chaotic, and frayed at the edges. Yet for those who lived through it, the decade was also a time of raw honesty, creative explosion, and a stubborn refusal to give up on the city's promise. The lights of the skyline still burned each night, reflected in the dark waters of the rivers, as if to say that no matter the trouble, New York would keep standing. Part 14. Revival and Renewal. By the early 1980s, New York City was emerging from the shadows of the turbulent 1970s. The financial crisis that had once brought the city to the brink of bankruptcy was slowly receding into memory. Streets that had seemed weary from neglect began to hum again with a new, if cautious, confidence. The process of revival was neither sudden nor smooth. It was the gradual work of years, a story written block by block, neighborhood by neighborhood. Economic groundwork. The first signs of recovery came in the form of stabilized finances. Stricter budgeting, enforced after the fiscal collapse, began to show results. The city's debt was still considerable, but the constant fear of bankruptcy had faded. Businesses, reassured by the greater fiscal discipline, began to return or expand. Developers who had once hesitated now saw opportunities in vacant lots and aging buildings. Wall Street, in particular, stirred back to life with a vigor that would soon reshape the city. The deregulation of financial markets and the rise of new investment vehicles brought unprecedented profits to the financial sector. Trading floors that had seemed subdued a decade earlier roared with activity. Young stockbrokers in tailored suits hurried through the narrow streets of the financial district, carrying the energy of a market that seemed to climb higher with each passing month. The wealth generated downtown began to ripple outward. Restaurants filled with business lunches, hotels saw more bookings from visiting clients, and real estate prices in certain neighborhoods began to edge upward again. While not everyone benefited equally from this new prosperity, the sense that New York's economic engine was turning once more gave the city a lift it badly needed. A changing cultural landscape. Even during the city's darker years, its cultural life had never truly dimmed, but now it began to expand with new momentum. Broadway welcomed a fresh wave of productions, from blockbuster musicals to experimental plays that drew audiences from around the world. Theaters thrived not only in the traditional district around Times Square, but also in off-Broadway and off-Broadway spaces scattered through the city, where smaller budgets often meant greater creative freedom. Music, too, reflected the city's renewal. The late 1970s punk scene that had thrived in clubs like CBGB was giving way to a more eclectic mix. New wave, hip-hop, and Latin rhythms that flowed from different corners of the city into the mainstream. Hip-hop, born in the Bronx in the previous decade, now began to travel far beyond its birthplace, carried on cassette tapes, radio stations, and live performances. Graffiti art, once dismissed as vandalism, gained recognition in galleries, its bold colors and urban energy seen as uniquely tied to the city's identity. Museums expanded their collections and programming. The Metropolitan Museum of Art and the Museum of Modern Art drew record visitors, while smaller institutions, from the Bronx Museum of the Arts to the Museum of the Chinese in America, highlighted the city's diversity. Art was not confined to galleries. Murals and public installations appeared in parks, plazas, and subway stations, making culture a visible part of daily life. The battle for the streets. One of the most visible markers of renewal was the slow but determined push to reclaim the city's public spaces. Crime, still high in the early 1980s, had kept many residents wary, especially after dark. But the city began investing in community policing, more visible patrols, and partnerships with neighborhood organizations. Graffiti-covered subway cars, once a symbol of disorder, were targeted in a sustained cleanup campaign. The Metropolitan Transportation Authority introduced new rolling stock, repainted old cars, and tightened security in train yards. It was not an overnight transformation, but over the course of the decade, the appearance and reliability of the subway began to improve. Times Square became a particular focus. Once notorious for its adult theaters and street crime, it drew the attention of developers and city officials determined to change its image. Bright billboards still lit the night, but now alongside them came plans for new theaters, shops, and family-friendly attractions. The process of transformation was contentious. Some lamented the loss of the gritty, unfiltered Times Square they knew, but it marked a turning point in the city's approach to revitalization. Neighborhood revivals. Revival was not limited to the most visible districts. In Soho, former manufacturing buildings converted into artists' lofts began attracting wealthier residents, eventually leading to the rise of upscale boutiques and galleries. The East Village, once defined by counterculture, saw an influx of cafes, bars, and music venues that drew younger crowds from across the city. In Brooklyn, neighborhoods like Park Slope and Brooklyn Heights began to gentrify, their brownstones restored and their tree-lined streets attracting professionals and families priced out of Manhattan. Williamsburg, still largely industrial, started to show the earliest signs of an artistic influx that would transform it in the decades to come. Harlem, long a cultural anchor, faced both challenges and opportunities. Community organizations worked to preserve its historic brownstones and support local businesses, while cultural institutions like the Apollo Theater remained beacons of the neighborhood's enduring influence. Festivals, parades, and street fairs kept traditions alive even as the area slowly drew investment. Chinatown and Little Italy, though changed by shifting demographics, continued to offer vibrant street life. In Chinatown, the sidewalks overflowed with market stalls selling everything from fresh fish to herbal remedies, while Little Italy's restaurants and cafes remained a draw for tourists and locals alike. The 1990s acceleration. By the early 1990s, the foundations laid in the previous decade began to pay off more visibly. Crime rates, after decades of stubborn resistance, started to fall. Improvements in policing, combined with demographic changes and economic growth, brought a level of safety to many neighborhoods that residents had not experienced in years. Streets once empty at night began to fill again with pedestrians, restaurants extended their hours, and public parks became more welcoming. Central Park, which had suffered from neglect, saw renewed care. The Central Park Conservancy, founded in the 1980s, led restoration projects that revived lawns, cleaned lakes, and repaired paths. Joggers, cyclists, and families returned in greater numbers, and concerts once again drew thousands to the Great Lawn. The city's economy diversified further. While finance remained a pillar, technology, media, and tourism grew in importance. The film industry discovered New York streets anew, using them as backdrops for movies and television shows that showcased the city's energy. Magazines, fashion houses, and advertising agencies flourished, cementing New York's role as a capital of style. Real estate markets reflected the boom. Apartment prices in Manhattan climbed steadily, pushing more people toward the outer boroughs. New developments rose along the waterfront in Brooklyn and Queens, offering views of the skyline that rivaled those from traditional Manhattan vantage points. The shift in where people lived and worked altered the city's map, making once overlooked neighborhoods newly desirable. Global stage. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, New York strengthened its position on the world stage. The United Nations continued to draw diplomats and international events, while the city hosted cultural exchanges, trade fairs, and global summits. International tourism surged, with visitors drawn by the city's museums, theater, shopping, and famous landmarks. The skyline evolved once more. The World Financial Center, completed in the late 1980s, brought a cluster of modern glass towers to Lower Manhattan, their stepped roofs a distinctive addition. Midtown saw its own wave of construction, with hotels and office buildings designed to project both modernity and prestige. Even the most everyday experiences seemed to carry an air of renewal. Riding a cleaned and air-conditioned subway car, walking through a park restored to green vibrancy, or seeing a long-abandoned building transformed into apartments or shops all fed the sense that New York was moving forward with purpose. A city reinvented. By the close of the 1990s, the transformation was undeniable. The fear and uncertainty of the 1970s had given way to something far more confident. Crime rates had dropped to levels not seen in decades, tourism numbers reached record highs, and the city's economy was diverse and robust. Times Square, once a shorthand for urban decline, had become a family destination, its digital billboards and bustling pedestrian plazas drawing millions each year. Yet the renewal came with complexities. Rising rents and property values priced many longtime residents out of their neighborhoods. The cultural scenes that had flourished in neglected spaces faced new pressures as those spaces became valuable real estate. Debates over gentrification and displacement grew louder, even as many acknowledged the improvements in safety and infrastructure. Still, the broad arc of the 1980s and 1990s was one of resurgence. New York had managed not only to recover from the crises of the previous decades, but to reassert itself as a city whose influence extended far beyond its borders. Its skyline was brighter, its streets busier, and its image, once battered by headlines of bankruptcy and crime, had been recast as a place of opportunity, culture, and global connection. The revival had not erased all of the city's struggles, but it had proven that New York could reinvent itself without losing the restless, layered identity that made it unique. As the 20th century drew to a close, the city was poised for yet another chapter, one that would begin with optimism, but would soon face challenges no one had yet imagined. Part 15. New York Today, the World's Crossroads. The 21st century opened with the skyline gleaming in the morning light, the towers and spires of Manhattan standing as proud markers of a city that had overcome decades of hardship. But within months of the new millennium's first year, New York would face a test unlike any in its history, one that would leave a lasting mark not only on its skyline, but on its heart. A morning in September. On September 11, 2001, the sun rose over the East River just as it had countless times before. Streets filled with the usual rush of commuters, the scent of coffee drifted from carts on corners, and the subways carried their usual load of sleepy riders toward the day's work. In Lower Manhattan, the twin towers of the World Trade Center caught the light as they had for decades, their vast silver faces reflecting the blue of the sky. That morning's stillness shattered at 8:46 a.m., when the first plane struck the North Tower. Minutes later, a second plane hit the South Tower. In the hours that followed, the world watched as smoke billowed into the clear sky, as firefighters and police raced toward danger, and as the towers, symbols of ambition and global connection, collapsed into clouds of dust and steel. The attacks claimed thousands of lives, changed the city's physical landscape, and left an enduring wound in the hearts of New Yorkers. The days after were filled with grief and silence. Streets usually alive with traffic stood empty, their stillness broken only by the wail of sirens. Yet amid the loss, a remarkable sense of unity emerged. Strangers helped one another through the thick air, offered water, carried supplies, and searched for survivors. Vigils lit the city's nights, and walls filled with photographs of the missing became places where people gathered to weep, to remember, and to hold one another up. Resilience and rebuilding. New York did not remain frozen in mourning. Slowly, the city began the long work of recovery. Businesses in Lower Manhattan reopened, construction crews cleared debris from the site, and plans for a new memorial and towers took shape. The effort was not only about replacing buildings, it was about affirming that the city would stand again. The rebuilding of the World Trade Center site became both a challenge and a statement. One World Trade Center, with its sleek, tapered form, eventually rose higher than any building in the Western Hemisphere. At its base, the 9/11 memorial pools marked the footprints of the fallen towers, their cascading water offering a quiet place for reflection amid the city's bustle. Names etched in bronze line the edges, a permanent reminder of those lost. The years following 2001 tested New York in other ways. The city's economy absorbed the shock of the attacks, the closure of much of Lower Manhattan, and the disruption to tourism. But within a few years, visitors returned in even greater numbers, drawn both by the memorial and by the enduring appeal of the city's cultural and commercial life. A city of many worlds. By the 2010s, New York had fully reasserted itself as a global crossroads. Its population passed 8 million, with more than a third born outside the United States. Walk down a single street in Queens, and you might hear a dozen languages, smell spices from every continent, and pass grocery stores, bakeries, and restaurants that reflect the far corners of the globe. This diversity is not new, it has been part of New York's identity for centuries, but in the present day, it is deeper and broader than ever. Neighborhoods like Jackson Heights, Flushing, and Sunset Park have become vibrant centers of immigrant life, where storefront signs appear in multiple languages and cultural festivals fill the streets. The city's cultural output remains unmatched. Broadway continues to draw audiences from around the world, while off-Broadway and independent theaters push creative boundaries. Museums range from the grand halls of the Metropolitan Museum of Art to smaller, focused institutions like El Museo del Barrio and the Tenement Museum. Music flows through every borough, from jazz sets in basement clubs to outdoor concerts in summer parks. Economic might and challenges. New York's economy in the 21st century is both powerful and complex. Wall Street remains a global financial center, its influence shaping markets across the world. Technology companies, once concentrated in Silicon Valley, have established strong footholds in the city, particularly in neighborhoods like Flatiron and Dumbo. Media, advertising, and fashion continue to flourish, and the city's universities draw students from every continent. Tourism has become a major driver of the economy, with millions visiting landmarks from Times Square to the Statue of Liberty each year. Hotels, restaurants, and cultural venues benefit from this constant flow of visitors, and the city's image as a must-see destination remains strong. Yet prosperity is uneven. Housing costs have soared, making it difficult for many to remain in neighborhoods where their families have lived for generations. Gentrification has transformed areas once considered overlooked into some of the most expensive in the nation. The contrast between luxury towers and struggling public housing developments is stark, a reminder that the challenges of inequality are as present now as they were in earlier eras. Moments of crisis and adaptation. In March 2020, New York once again found itself at the center of a crisis, this time, a global pandemic. COVID-19 swept through the city with alarming speed, filling hospitals and emptying streets. The hum of traffic and chatter that had defined New York for centuries gave way to an eerie quiet. Subways ran nearly empty, Broadway theaters went dark, and small businesses shuttered, some never to reopen. The losses were heavy, both in lives and livelihoods. Yet, as in past trials, the city adapted. Restaurants created outdoor dining setups along sidewalks, musicians performed from fire escapes, and mutual aid networks formed to deliver food and medicine to those in need. By 2021, vaccines and public health measures allowed the city to reopen gradually, and life began to flow back into the streets. The pandemic left its own mark, not only in grief but in altered patterns of work and living. Remote work reshaped office districts, with some buildings converting to residential use. Public spaces became even more central to city life, as people sought fresh air and connection. The crisis underscored both the vulnerabilities and the resilience of a city where millions live side by side. A living, breathing crossroads. Today, New York's role as the capital of the world is not just a matter of finance or politics. It is visible in the everyday lives of its residents. On any given morning, the subway carries chefs, bankers, students, construction workers, artists, and nurses, all sharing the same space as they move toward their destinations. In the parks, joggers pass children at play, elderly neighbors read newspapers on benches, and street performers gather small crowds with music or magic tricks. Events of global significance unfold here alongside the rhythms of daily life. Heads of state arrive for the United Nations General Assembly while, a few blocks away, office workers line up at food trucks. Major fashion shows, art fairs, and sports championships draw international attention. Yet the essence of the city is still found in its neighborhoods, in corner bodegas, block parties, and late-night diners where conversation flows as easily as the coffee. The skyline continues to evolve. New residential towers have joined the ranks of the city's tallest buildings, their glass facades catching the shifting light. The rebuilt World Trade Center complex stands as both a memorial and a symbol of renewal. From the East River to the Hudson, the city's profile remains instantly recognizable, its mix of old landmarks and new designs telling the story of constant reinvention. An unfinished story. New York's history is a chain of transformations. From Lenape villages to Dutch outpost, from colonial port to industrial powerhouse, from near bankruptcy to global capital, it has never stood still for long. Each generation inherits a city that is both the sum of what came before and a canvas for what will come next. Today's challenges, affordability, climate resilience, public safety, and equitable growth, are part of that ongoing story. Rising seas threaten low-lying neighborhoods, pushing the city to invest in sea walls and green infrastructure. Housing shortages drive debates over development and preservation. The balance between economic dynamism and the protection of community life is constantly renegotiated. And yet, the spirit that carried New York through fires, depressions, blackouts, attacks, and pandemics still pulses in its streets. It can be felt in the quiet determination of a shopkeeper opening early, in the laughter of friends meeting in Washington Square Park, in the applause of a Broadway audience on a rainy night. Standing on the Brooklyn Bridge at sunset, looking back toward Manhattan, it's easy to see why the city calls itself the world's crossroads. The skyline glows in gold and steel, ferries cut across the rivers, and countless lives, each with its own path, its own story, intersect here. The air carries a mix of languages, the smell of food from a dozen cultures, the sound of footsteps and wheels. This is New York today, vast, imperfect, endlessly changing, and unshakably alive. It is a place where history meets the present at every corner, and where the future is being written every hour by the millions who call it home.